A devoted Lutheran father and his entire family vanished from their 19-room Victorian mansion during a cold November night, leaving their tight-knit community questioning what evil could penetrate such a godly household. But 18 years later, a forensic sculptor creates a clay bust that would expose the most shocking family annihilator in American history and reveal the horrifying religious delusions that drove a Sunday school teacher to methodically execute his own blood. This is the true account of how one man's twisted interpretation of salvation led to 5 brutal murders, decades of deception, and one of the most remarkable captures in criminal justice history, a case where science, psychology, and divine intervention collided to bring a monster hiding in plain sight to justice. On the morning of November 9, 1971, John Emil List woke up in his sprawling Victorian mansion and made a decision that would haunt America for nearly 2 decades. By sunset, 5 members of his family would be dead by his own hand, and he would disappear into the shadows, living under a false identity while the entire nation searched for the Sunday school teacher who had become a cold-blooded killer. The man who taught children about God's love had convinced himself that murder was an act of divine mercy, and the secrets he harbored about his family's hidden struggles would not surface until a miraculous breakthrough in forensic science brought him face to face with justice 18 years later. In the quiet suburban community of Westfield, New Jersey, few families appeared more blessed than the Lists. Their imposing 19-room Victorian mansion, known as Breeze Knoll, stood like a testament to the American dream, a towering symbol of success, faith, and family values. Located at 431 Hillside Avenue, the grand estate featured ornate rooms, intricate woodwork, and a magnificent ballroom, with a stained glass skylight rumored to be an original Tiffany creation worth over $100,000. John Emil List seemed to embody everything the community valued. Born in Bay City, Michigan, on September 17, 1925, he was the only child of devout German-American parents who instilled in him an unwavering Lutheran faith. Like his father before him, John became a dedicated Sunday school teacher, known throughout the congregation for his meticulous preparation and passionate devotion to Scripture. His neighbors saw him as the model Christian man, disciplined, hard-working, and committed to his family's spiritual well-being. After graduating from Bay City Central High School in 1943, John enlisted in the United States Army and served as a laboratory technician during World War II. His military service shaped his character, instilling the precision and methodical approach that would later characterize both his professional success and his carefully planned crimes. Following his discharge in 1946, John pursued higher education at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where he earned a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's degree in accounting. His academic excellence earned him a commission as a lieutenant through the Reserve Officers Training Corps. When the Korean War escalated in November 1950, John was recalled to active military service at Fort Eustis in Virginia. It was there that he met the woman who would become his wife and first victim, a widow whose hidden secrets would contribute to the family's eventual destruction. The woman, recently widowed after her infantry officer husband was killed in action in Korea, lived nearby with her daughter Brenda from her first marriage. The courtship moved quickly, perhaps too quickly for a man of John's methodical nature. The widow claimed she was pregnant, pressing John to marry her immediately. His Lutheran upbringing and moral convictions left him no choice but to honor his commitment, even though he felt manipulated. They wed on December 1, 1951, in Baltimore, Maryland, and the newly formed family moved to Northern California, where John was reassigned to the Army Finance Corps. But the marriage began with deception that would poison their relationship for decades. The pregnancy was false, a calculated lie designed to trap John into marriage. Though he felt betrayed, his religious beliefs prohibited divorce, leaving him trapped in a union built on dishonesty. Even worse, his new wife had concealed a devastating secret. She suffered from syphilis, contracted from her first husband, a disease that would progressively damage her mental state and fuel her growing alcoholism. After completing his second tour of duty in 1952, John transitioned to civilian life, working for an accounting firm in Detroit before accepting a position as an audit supervisor at a paper company in Kalamazoo, Michigan. It was during their years in Kalamazoo that their 3 children were born: Patricia in 1955, John Frederick in 1956, and Frederick in 1958. To outside observers, they appeared to be a thriving American family, father advancing in his career, mother devoted to raising their children, and a household centered around Christian values. By 1959, John had risen to general supervisor of the company's accounting department, but beneath the surface of professional success, his home life was deteriorating rapidly. His wife's alcoholism worsened as the untreated syphilis continued its destructive course, causing increasing instability and erratic behavior. The disease, which she had never disclosed before their marriage, was slowly destroying her mind, while the alcohol numbed her pain and John's growing resentment. In 1960, their stepdaughter Brenda married and left the household, prompting John to relocate his remaining family to Rochester, New York, where he accepted a position with Xerox Corporation. His accounting skills and attention to detail quickly earned recognition, and he eventually became director of accounting services. To his colleagues and neighbors in Rochester, John List appeared to be a man blessed with professional success and a strong family foundation. The pinnacle of John's apparent success came in 1965 when he accepted a prestigious position as vice president and comptroller at a bank in Jersey City, New Jersey. With this promotion came the opportunity to purchase Breeze Knoll, the magnificent Victorian mansion that would become both the symbol of his achievements and the scene of his most horrific crimes. The family moved into their new home along with John's elderly mother, Alma, who occupied a private apartment in the mansion's attic. Breeze Knoll represented everything John believed he had worked toward: a grand home befitting a successful professional, space for his expanding family, and a place where his mother could live out her final years in comfort and dignity. The mansion's 19 rooms provided ample space for entertaining fellow church members and hosting Bible study groups. The ornate ballroom, with its stunning stained glass skylight, became a focal point for family gatherings and community events. But the impressive facade concealed mounting problems that John felt powerless to address. His wife's condition continued to deteriorate as both the syphilis and alcoholism took their toll. Her behavior became increasingly unpredictable, embarrassing John in front of church members and neighbors who had come to expect perfection from their model Christian family. The progressive nature of syphilis meant that her mental faculties were slowly being destroyed, leading to paranoid episodes and violent outbursts that John struggled to hide from the outside world. The children, now teenagers, were beginning to show signs of rebellion that deeply troubled their father's rigid religious sensibilities. Patricia, 16 years old, was developing interests that John considered worldly and inappropriate for a Christian young woman. John Frederick, 15, was becoming increasingly independent and questioning some of the strict religious rules that governed their household. Frederick, 13, was the most compliant of the children, but even he occasionally challenged his father's authority in ways that John found deeply disturbing. John's elderly mother, Alma, 84 years old, and residing in the mansion's attic apartment, had become another source of stress. While she shared his devout Lutheran faith, she was also a constant reminder of his financial obligations and the mounting pressure to maintain their expensive lifestyle. The cost of maintaining Breeze Knoll, combined with his wife's medical needs and his mother's care, was creating financial strain that John felt unable to discuss with anyone. The bank where John worked as vice president and comptroller was also experiencing difficulties that would soon impact his employment. Economic pressures in the late 1960s were affecting financial institutions across the country, and John's position, while prestigious, was not as secure as it appeared. His meticulous nature and perfectionist tendencies, which had served him well in accounting, began to work against him as he struggled to adapt to changing business conditions. Perhaps most troubling for John was his growing conviction that the world around his family was becoming increasingly corrupt and dangerous. His strict Lutheran beliefs led him to view modern society as spiritually bankrupt, filled with temptations that could lead his children away from their faith and toward eternal damnation. He became obsessed with protecting his family's souls, even as he felt powerless to protect their earthly circumstances. The pressure of maintaining appearances while dealing with hidden family crises was slowly consuming John's mental stability. His rigid personality, shaped by military discipline and religious dogma, left him unable to seek help or acknowledge the problems that were destroying his family from within. Instead, he retreated deeper into his faith, searching for answers in scripture and prayer, while his carefully constructed world began to crumble around him. Church members and neighbors continued to view the List family as a model of Christian success, unaware of the darkness growing within the walls of Breeze Knoll. John's reputation as a devoted Sunday school teacher and dedicated family man remained intact, even as he began to contemplate the unthinkable, a solution that would preserve his family's souls while destroying their earthly existence forever. As 1971 progressed, the various pressures in John's life reached a critical point. His wife's condition showed no signs of improvement. His children continued to drift away from the strict religious path he demanded. His mother required increasing care, and his job security was becoming uncertain. The magnificent mansion that had once symbolized his success now felt like a prison, trapping him in a life he could no longer sustain but felt unable to escape. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shock the nation and demonstrate how far a man might go when his rigid beliefs collide with overwhelming circumstances. The Sunday school teacher who preached about God's love was about to become an instrument of death, convinced that only through murder could he save the souls he loved most in the world. The autumn of 1971 brought an unexpected crisis that would push John List beyond the breaking point. In October, just weeks before the murders, John received devastating news that shattered the last remnants of his carefully maintained facade. The Jersey City bank where he served as vice president and comptroller was closing, and his position was being eliminated. For a man whose entire identity was built around professional success and financial stability, this development represented more than just unemployment. It was the complete collapse of everything he had worked to achieve. But rather than tell his family about this catastrophic change, John made a decision that revealed the depths of his psychological deterioration. Each morning he continued his usual routine, dressing in his business suits and leaving the house as if heading to work. Instead of going to the bank, he spent his days at the Westfield Public Library, reading religious texts and contemplating what he saw as his family's inevitable spiritual corruption. He attended job interviews sporadically, but his heart was no longer in pursuing earthly success. During these long days away from home, John's mind became consumed with apocalyptic visions of his family's future. He convinced himself that without his income, they would be forced to leave Breeze Knoll and move to a poorer neighborhood where his children would be exposed to drugs, crime, and moral decay. In his twisted reasoning, such exposure would lead them away from their Lutheran faith and condemn their souls to eternal damnation. The man who had spent decades teaching Sunday school lessons about God's mercy began to contemplate the ultimate act of what he saw as divine intervention. John's wife remained unaware of their changed circumstances, lost in her own battles with alcoholism and the advancing effects of syphilis. Her condition had reached a point where she could barely function as a mother or wife, often spending entire days in an alcohol-induced stupor while John struggled to maintain the household and care for his elderly mother. The progressive brain damage caused by untreated syphilis had made her increasingly paranoid and prone to violent outbursts, creating an atmosphere of tension that even the children could not ignore. 16-year-old Patricia was beginning to rebel against her father's strict religious rules in ways that filled John with terror for her soul. She had started showing interest in popular music, which John viewed as inherently evil, and was spending time with friends whose families he considered insufficiently devout. Her natural teenage desire for independence clashed violently with John's need to control every aspect of his family's spiritual development, creating constant conflict that drove him deeper into his religious obsessions. John Frederick, 15 and athletic, had joined the soccer team at Westfield High School, an activity that John reluctantly permitted but viewed with suspicion. The boy was developing friendships with teammates whose families did not share the List's strict Lutheran beliefs, and John worried constantly about the influences these relationships might have on his son's faith. The teenager's natural questioning of religious doctrine, normal for his age, struck John as evidence of dangerous spiritual drift that required immediate correction. 13-year-old Frederick was still the most compliant of the children, but even he was beginning to show signs of the independence that terrified his father. The boy's questions about church teachings and his occasional challenges to household rules convinced John that corruption was beginning to take hold even in his youngest son. In John's increasingly distorted worldview, these normal aspects of adolescent development represented existential threats to his children's eternal souls. Meanwhile, 84-year-old Alma List remained in her attic apartment, largely unaware of the gathering storm below. The elderly woman shared her son's devout faith, but lacked his paranoid interpretations of modern society. She had noticed changes in John's behavior, his increased agitation, his longer periods of prayer, and his growing isolation from the rest of the family, but attributed these changes to normal stress rather than the dangerous psychological deterioration that was actually occurring. As November arrived, John's financial situation became increasingly desperate. The family's savings were nearly exhausted, and without his income, they would soon be unable to maintain their expensive lifestyle. The thought of losing Breeze Knoll filled John with panic, not because of the loss of prestige, but because he believed such a dramatic change in circumstances would destroy his family's faith and doom their souls. In his mind, poverty and spiritual corruption were inextricably linked, making financial ruin equivalent to eternal damnation. The pressure of maintaining his deception while contemplating his family's future pushed John into a state of psychological crisis. that his rigid personality could not handle. Instead of seeking help from his pastor or confiding in fellow church members, he retreated deeper into prayer and Bible study, searching for divine guidance that would never come. His interpretation of Scripture became increasingly twisted as he looked for justification for the thoughts that were consuming his mind. During the first week of November, John's planning became more concrete and methodical. His accounting background and military training combined to create a systematic approach to what he now saw as an inevitable solution. He began making lists, a habit that had served him well in business, but now took on a sinister purpose as he planned the methodical execution of his own family. The man who had once used his organizational skills to manage corporate finances now applied the same meticulous attention to detail to mass murder. John's religious delusions provided him with the justification he needed to proceed with his horrific plan. He convinced himself that by killing his family before they could be corrupted by poverty and worldly influences, he would be ensuring their passage to heaven while they were still in a state of grace. This twisted logic allowed him to reframe mass murder as an act of supreme parental love, the ultimate sacrifice to guarantee his family's eternal salvation. On November 8th, the day before the murders, John made his final preparations with the cold efficiency that had characterized his professional life. He visited local banks to close both his and his mother's accounts, withdrawing the remaining funds they would need for his planned escape. He also made arrangements to stop mail and newspaper delivery to the house, creating the illusion that the family had departed for an extended vacation. These practical details revealed the calculated nature of his intentions, while demonstrating his continued ability to function normally despite his psychological breakdown. That evening, John spent what would be his final night in Breeze Knoll, surrounded by the family he planned to kill. He helped his children with their homework, attended to his mother's needs, and maintained the facade of normalcy that had become second nature to him. His wife, lost in her usual alcohol-induced haze, remained unaware that her husband was planning her death along with those of her children and mother-in-law. As John lay in bed that night, listening to his family sleep around him, he felt what he later described as a sense of divine peace about his decision. The psychological mechanisms that might have prevented a normal person from committing such atrocities had been overwhelmed by his rigid religious beliefs and perfectionist personality. In his distorted mind, the murders he planned for the following morning represented the greatest act of love and sacrifice he could perform for his family. The morning of November 9, 1971, dawned clear and cold in Westfield, New Jersey. John List woke early, as was his habit, and began his final day as a free man with the same methodical routine that had governed his entire adult life. But this morning would be different. By nightfall, 5 people would be dead, and one of America's most notorious family annihilators would begin an 18-year journey as a fugitive from justice. The countdown to mass murder had begun, and nothing could stop the horrific events that John List had convinced himself were acts of divine mercy. The Sunday school teacher who had spent decades preaching about God's love was about to demonstrate the terrifying consequences of religious fanaticism when combined with psychological breakdown and a rigid personality unable to adapt to life's inevitable challenges. The morning routine in the List household on November 9th began like countless others, with no indication that this would be the day that destroyed 5 lives and launched one of America's longest manhunts. John List woke at his usual time, showered, and dressed in one of his conservative business suits, maintaining the appearance of a man heading to work despite having been unemployed for weeks. His wife remained in bed, sleeping off another night of heavy drinking, while the children prepared for what would be their final day of school. As John ate his breakfast in the mansion's formal dining room, he felt an unnatural calm settle over him. The man who had spent weeks agonizing over his decision now moved with the mechanical precision that had characterized his military service and accounting career. He had convinced himself that what he was about to do represented the ultimate act of paternal love, saving his family's souls by ending their earthly lives before corruption could claim them. After the children left for school, John retrieved the weapons he had carefully prepared for his grim task. His 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic handgun, legally purchased and properly registered, would serve as his primary instrument of death. He also had his father's Colt .22 caliber revolver, a family heirloom that would add bitter irony to the murders of his own family members. Both weapons had been cleaned and loaded with the same meticulous care John applied to all his responsibilities. His first victim was his wife, the woman whose deception about pregnancy had trapped him in their troubled marriage 20 years earlier. She was sitting in the kitchen, sipping her morning coffee, and likely planning another day of drinking to escape the reality of her deteriorating mental state. John approached her from behind and fired a single shot into the back of her head, killing her instantly. The woman who had concealed her syphilis and fabricated a pregnancy now lay dead on the kitchen floor, her coffee cup still steaming beside her lifeless body. John's methodical nature asserted itself even in murder. He cleaned up the blood, moved his wife's body, and prepared for his next victim. Climbing to the third floor where his elderly mother maintained her private apartment, John found Alma List in her bed, likely reading her morning devotions as was her custom. The 84-year-old woman who had raised him in the Lutheran faith and supported his religious convictions became his second victim when he shot her above the left eye. She died without knowing that her son, the Sunday school teacher she was so proud of, had become a cold-blooded killer. With 2 family members dead, John had to wait for his children to return from school. This interval revealed the calculating nature of his mind. Rather than rushing through the murders in a frenzy of emotion, he maintained his composure and even made himself a sandwich. The man who was systematically destroying his family paused to eat lunch in the same kitchen where his wife's blood had been spilled hours earlier. When 16-year-old Patricia arrived home from school, she walked unsuspectingly into her father's trap. John shot her in the back of the head as she entered the house, killing her instantly. Minutes later, 13-year-old Frederick met the same fate, gunned down by the father he trusted completely. 2 more of John's children were dead, but his horrific work was not yet complete. The most challenging part of John's plan remained, waiting for 15-year-old John Frederick to return from his high school soccer game. Rather than simply wait at home with 4 bodies, John made a decision that demonstrated both his continuing need to maintain appearances and his complete psychological detachment from the reality of his crimes. He drove to Westfield High School to watch his son play soccer, cheering from the sidelines as if he were a normal father supporting his child's athletic endeavors. Witnesses later reported that John appeared completely normal during the soccer game, chatting with other parents and showing appropriate interest in the match. No one suspected that this seemingly devoted father had already murdered 4 family members and was planning to kill his final victim as soon as the game ended. The ability to maintain such a facade while carrying out mass murder revealed the depths of John's psychological disorder and his capacity for deception. After the game concluded, John offered his son a ride home, a gesture that John Frederick undoubtedly interpreted as normal fatherly care. The boy climbed into the car with the man who had taught him to throw a football, helped him with homework, and taken him to church every Sunday of his life. He had no way of knowing that his father was planning his murder during the short drive back to Breeze Knoll. When they arrived at the mansion, John Frederick's fate diverged from his siblings in a way that would haunt investigators for decades. Unlike his mother, grandmother, and sisters who were killed with single shots, the teenage boy was shot multiple times. Physical evidence later revealed that John Frederick had attempted to defend himself, suggesting that he realized his father's intentions and fought for his life. The struggle that ensued resulted in multiple gunshot wounds before John finally killed his eldest son, completing his methodical destruction of his entire family. With all 5 family members dead, John began the final phase of his carefully planned escape. He arranged the bodies of his wife and 3 children on sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom, positioning them beneath the magnificent Tiffany stained glass skylight, as if creating some twisted religious tableau. His mother's body remained in her attic apartment, perhaps because moving her would have been too physically demanding, or because he wanted to preserve some dignity for the woman who had raised him. John then composed a 5-page letter to his pastor, attempting to explain and justify the murders he had just committed. In this rambling confession, he claimed that he had killed his family to save their souls from the corruption that would inevitably result from their changed financial circumstances. He expressed his belief that by ending their lives while they were still in a state of grace, he had guaranteed their passage to heaven and prevented their fall into sin and damnation. The letter revealed the depth of John's religious delusions and his complete inability to recognize the evil of his actions. He wrote as if he had performed a great service for his family, sacrificing his own spiritual welfare to ensure their eternal salvation. This twisted logic allowed him to maintain his self-image as a devoted father and faithful Christian, even as he stood surrounded by the bodies of his murdered family. Before leaving Breeze Knoll forever, John performed one final act that demonstrated his continuing obsession with control and appearances. He systematically removed his face from every family photograph in the mansion, ensuring that investigators would have difficulty identifying him or tracking his movements. This methodical destruction of evidence showed that despite his claims of divine guidance, John was fully aware that he had committed crimes and was taking practical steps to avoid capture. John also tuned the mansion's radio to a religious station and left lights burning throughout the house, creating the illusion that the family was still in residence. He stopped mail and newspaper delivery, and left notes at the children's schools claiming they would be absent due to a family emergency. These deceptions would buy him precious time before the bodies were discovered, and the manhunt began. Finally, John List walked out of Breeze Knoll for the last time, leaving behind the bodies of 5 family members and beginning his transformation from respected community member to America's most wanted fugitive. He drove his green 1963 Chevrolet Impala to John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, where he abandoned it in the parking lot with a November 10th parking ticket as the only clue to his movements after the murders. From that point, John List effectively disappeared, beginning an 18-year journey that would take him across the country and allow him to build an entirely new identity. The manhunt that followed would involve the FBI, local law enforcement agencies, and eventually the nascent field of forensic sculpture. But for nearly 2 decades, the Sunday school teacher turned family killer would remain one step ahead of justice. The discovery of the bodies would not occur for nearly a month, giving John an enormous head start in his escape. When neighbors finally became concerned enough to contact police, they would find a scene of horror that shocked even experienced investigators. The ballroom of Breeze Knoll, once a symbol of the List family's success and respectability, had become a tomb containing the remains of 4 family members arranged in a grotesque display that revealed both the killer's methodical nature and his twisted religious motivations. As investigators began to piece together the evidence, they would realize they were dealing with one of the most calculating and cold-blooded family annihilators in American criminal history. The search for John List would become one of the longest and most frustrating manhunts in FBI history, complicated by his complete erasure of photographic evidence and his ability to assume a new identity with frightening efficiency. But 18 years later, advances in forensic science and the power of television would combine to bring John List's carefully constructed new life crashing down around him, proving that even the most meticulous criminals cannot escape justice forever. December 7, 1971, dawned crisp and clear in Westfield, New Jersey, nearly a month after John List had vanished into the American landscape. For weeks, neighbors had noticed something strange about the imposing Victorian mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue. Every room blazed with light day and night, yet no one had seen any of the List family members coming or going. The massive house stood like a illuminated ghost ship in the quiet suburban neighborhood, beautiful and mysterious but somehow wrong. The first signs that something was amiss came from the mundane details of daily life. Mail was piling up despite John's instructions to hold delivery. Newspapers were accumulating on the front steps, and the children had been absent from school for weeks despite notes claiming they were visiting a sick grandmother. Teachers at Westfield High School became increasingly concerned when John Frederick failed to appear for important soccer games, and Patricia missed weeks of her junior year without any communication from the family. When neighbors finally decided to investigate, they discovered that their worst fears were justified. Police entered through an unlocked basement window and began a systematic search that would reveal one of the most shocking crime scenes in New Jersey history. The ballroom, with its magnificent stained glass skylight and polished wooden floors, had been transformed into a macabre family tomb, where 4 bodies lay arranged on sleeping bags with disturbing precision. The scene that greeted investigators defied comprehension. John's wife lay beside their 3 children, Patricia, John Frederick, and Frederick, arranged as if they were merely sleeping beneath the colorful light filtering through the Tiffany skylight. Each had been killed by gunshot wounds to the head, executed with clinical efficiency by someone they had trusted completely. A search of the mansion's 3rd floor revealed the body of 84-year-old Alma List in her attic apartment, also shot to death. The methodical nature of the crime scene immediately told investigators they were dealing with an unusually calculating killer. The bodies had been carefully positioned, the house had been cleaned of obvious evidence, and efforts had been made to delay discovery of the murders. Most chilling of all was the discovery that someone had systematically removed John List from every family photograph in the mansion, eliminating visual evidence that could aid in his identification and capture. The 5-page letter left on John's desk provided insight into his twisted motivations, but offered little help in tracking his whereabouts. His rambling explanation of saving his family's souls from earthly corruption revealed a man consumed by religious delusions, but gave no clues about where he might have fled or what identity he might have assumed. The man who had taught Sunday school for years had convinced himself that mass murder was an act of divine mercy. The manhunt for John List began immediately, but investigators quickly realized they were facing unprecedented challenges. The systematic destruction of photographs meant they had no recent images of the fugitive, only outdated pictures from years before the murders. His meticulous planning had given him a month's head start, and his background in accounting and military service suggested he had the skills necessary to disappear completely. The green Chevrolet Impala found at John F. Kennedy Airport provided the only concrete lead, but it raised more questions than answers. The November 10th parking ticket indicated John had abandoned the car the day after the murders, but extensive investigation revealed no evidence that he had boarded any flights. He had simply vanished into the anonymity of New York City, and from there into the vast expanse of America. For the next 18 years, John List became one of America's most wanted fugitives, but the trail remained frustratingly cold. The FBI investigated hundreds of tips and leads without success, hampered by the lack of current photographs and John's apparent ability to completely reinvent himself. The case became a symbol of how a methodical criminal could disappear into American society, especially in an era before modern surveillance technology and computerized databases. Meanwhile, in Colorado, a mild-mannered accountant named Robert Clark was building a new life that bore striking similarities to John List's previous existence. Clark was devoutly religious, attended Lutheran services regularly, and worked diligently in accounting positions while maintaining a low profile in his community. He was helpful to fellow church members, reliable in his employment, and gave no indication of harboring one of America's darkest secrets. In 1979, Robert Clark began working as a comptroller at a paper box manufacturer outside Denver, a position that utilized the same accounting skills that had made John List successful in his previous life. His colleagues found him competent but unremarkable, a quiet man who did his job efficiently and avoided drawing attention to himself. No one suspected that this seemingly ordinary accountant was actually one of the most wanted men in America. Clark's personal life also echoed patterns from John List's past. At a church gathering, he met Dolores Miller, an Army PX clerk who shared his religious convictions and appreciation for a quiet, orderly lifestyle. Their courtship proceeded with the same methodical approach that had characterized everything in both of Clark's identities, and they married in 1985 in a ceremony that friends described as simple but heartfelt. The couple lived quietly in the Denver suburbs until 1988, when they moved to Midlothian, Virginia, where Clark resumed his accounting career at a small firm called Madrea, Joyner, Kirkham and Woody. Their new life in the Richmond suburbs seemed to represent the perfect retirement destination for a couple seeking peace and stability. Neighbors found them pleasant but private, the kind of people who kept their lawns neat and attended church regularly without causing any trouble. But in May 1989, advances in forensic science and the emerging power of television would combine to shatter Robert Clark's carefully constructed existence. The Fox network's new program, America's Most Wanted, decided to feature the List family murders during its first season, recognizing that the case represented exactly the kind of unsolved crime that could benefit from national exposure and viewer tips. The challenge facing the show's producers was the same one that had stymied investigators for 18 years. How do you find a man when you don't know what he looks like? The solution came from an unlikely source: forensic sculptor Frank Bender, an artist who specialized in creating facial reconstructions from skeletal remains and age progression models for long-term fugitives. Frank Bender's assignment seemed almost impossible. Take photographs of John List from the 1970s and create a sculpture showing how he might appear after 18 years of aging. But Bender brought both artistic skill and scientific methodology to the challenge, consulting with psychologists and medical experts to understand how stress, guilt, and the passage of time might have changed List's appearance. Working with criminal psychologist Richard Walter, Bender developed a psychological profile that would guide his artistic choices. They theorized that List would maintain many of his previous habits and preferences, including his style of dress and choice of eyewear. The psychologist believed that a man who had carefully constructed a new identity would still cling to familiar elements that provided comfort and continuity with his past life. Bender's clay sculpture incorporated these psychological insights, with scientific knowledge about how facial features change with age. He added weight to reflect normal aging, adjusted the hairline to show male pattern baldness, and deepened facial lines to suggest the passage of nearly 2 decades. Most importantly, he equipped his sculpture with thick-rimmed glasses similar to those List had worn in the 1970s, betting that the fugitive would maintain this distinctive element of his appearance. When America's Most Wanted aired the List segment on May 21, 1989, viewers across the country saw Frank Bender's age progression sculpture and heard the horrific details of the family murders. The response was immediate and overwhelming. More than 200 tips poured in from viewers who believed they recognized the sculpture or had information about John List's possible whereabouts. One of those tips came from Wanda Flannery, a woman in Colorado who had been watching the program with her daughter. Both women were struck by the uncanny resemblance between Bender's sculpture and their former neighbor, Robert Clark. The mild-mannered accountant who had lived quietly in their community for years suddenly seemed to match the description of one of America's most wanted fugitives. Flannery's tip to authorities included crucial details about Clark's background that matched elements of John List's profile: his work as an accountant, his devout Lutheran faith, and his general appearance and mannerisms. Most importantly, she was able to provide investigators with Clark's current address in Virginia, where he had moved with his wife Dolores just 1 year earlier. FBI agents immediately began surveillance of the small accounting firm in Richmond where Robert Clark worked, waiting for confirmation that this mild-mannered Virginia accountant was indeed the New Jersey family killer they had been seeking for 18 years. The resemblance to Frank Bender's sculpture was so striking that agents were confident they had found their man, but they needed concrete evidence to make an arrest. On June 1, 1989, less than 2 weeks after the America's Most Wanted broadcast, FBI agents arrested Robert Clark at his workplace without incident. The quiet accountant who had spent 18 years hiding in plain sight offered no resistance as he was taken into custody, maintaining his false identity even as evidence mounted against him. The fingerprint comparison that followed confirmed what investigators already knew. Robert Clark was indeed John Emil List, the Sunday school teacher who had murdered his entire family and vanished into the American heartland. The methodical killer who had spent nearly 2 decades building a new life was finally in custody, brought down by an unlikely combination of forensic artistry and television technology. Frank Bender's sculpture had proven remarkably accurate, capturing not just List's aged appearance, but also his psychological attachment to familiar elements like his distinctive eyewear. The case became a landmark in forensic science, demonstrating how artistic skill and psychological profiling could combine to solve even the most challenging cold cases. As news of the arrest spread, investigators and the public alike marveled at the circumstances that had brought List to justice. After 18 years of freedom, during which he had successfully created a new identity and built a new life, the fugitive had been undone by a clay sculpture created by an artist working from decades-old photographs and psychological theories. The capture of John List represented more than just the solution to a cold case. It demonstrated the evolving power of media and forensic science to bring even the most careful criminals to justice, no matter how much time had passed or how completely they believed they had reinvented themselves. The arrest of Robert Clark in Richmond, Virginia, marked the beginning of the end for one of America's longest-running manhunts. But John List was not ready to abandon the identity that had protected him for 18 years. Even as FBI agents presented overwhelming evidence of his true identity, including fingerprint matches from his military records and forensic comparisons to evidence found at the crime scene, List maintained his facade as the mild-mannered accountant Robert Clark. For months following his arrest and extradition to New Jersey, List continued his deception with the same methodical determination that had characterized his escape and his crimes. His lawyers worked to challenge the evidence, while List himself seemed to believe that if he maintained his false identity long enough, somehow the truth would disappear. This behavior revealed the same rigid thinking that had prevented him from seeking help during his original crisis and had ultimately led to the murders. The psychological evaluation conducted during this period provided chilling insights into List's mental state. Even after 18 years, he showed no genuine remorse for his actions, instead maintaining that he had acted out of love and religious conviction. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes while building a new life demonstrated a level of psychological detachment that experts found deeply disturbing. Finally, on February 12, 1990, faced with irrefutable fingerprint evidence and mounting forensic proof, John Emil List abandoned his Robert Clark persona and confessed his true identity. The quiet acknowledgement came not in a dramatic courtroom scene, but in a simple statement to his attorneys that he was indeed the man who had murdered his family in 1971. The confession opened the floodgates for a detailed investigation into List's actions during his 18 years as a fugitive. Investigators discovered that he had initially fled to Michigan after the murders, then traveled to Colorado, where he had assumed the Robert Clark identity, using the name of a college classmate. His choice of identity showed careful planning. Clark was a real person whose background could provide a paper trail for employment and other official purposes. List's life as Robert Clark revealed both his ability to function normally and his psychological need to recreate elements of his previous existence. He had sought out accounting positions that matched his professional skills, joined Lutheran congregations that satisfied his religious needs, and eventually married a woman whose quiet demeanor reminded many observers of his first wife. Even his choice of residence in suburban Denver and later Virginia echoed his preference for middle-class communities where he could blend into the background. The trial that followed List's confession became a national sensation, offering the public its first detailed look at the mind of a family annihilator. Prosecutors presented evidence of the methodical planning that preceded the murders, the cold efficiency with which they were carried out, and the calculated nature of List's escape and identity change. The case became a textbook example of how mental illness and religious fanaticism could combine with a rigid personality to produce horrific violence. List's defense team attempted to argue that their client's actions were the result of severe mental illness brought on by financial stress and family problems. They painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control, driven to desperate measures by his inability to cope with failure and change. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological pressures that could drive a seemingly normal person to commit acts of extreme violence. But prosecutors countered with evidence of List's methodical planning and his ability to function normally for 18 years after the murders. They argued that his actions showed clear premeditation and consciousness of guilt, pointing to his systematic destruction of evidence and his successful creation of a new identity as proof that he knew his actions were wrong and took steps to avoid consequences. The testimony about List's religious motivations proved particularly disturbing to observers. His twisted interpretation of Lutheran doctrine had convinced him that murder was preferable to allowing his family to face poverty and potential moral corruption. This perversion of religious teaching demonstrated how even faith intended to promote love and compassion could be distorted by a damaged mind into justification for unspeakable evil. During the trial, List's demeanor remained calm and detached, showing little emotion even when confronted with crime scene photographs and evidence of his family's suffering. His apparent inability to comprehend the magnitude of his crimes or to express genuine remorse troubled both legal experts and mental health professionals who evaluated him. The jury's verdict came swiftly and decisively, guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming, and List's ability to function normally for 18 years undermined any claims of mental incapacity at the time of the crimes. Each count carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment, ensuring that List would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people. At his sentencing hearing, List was given the opportunity to address the court and the families of his victims. His statement revealed the continuing delusions that had driven him to murder, as he expressed regret for the pain he had caused, but maintained that his actions were motivated by love and concern for his family's spiritual welfare. This inability to recognize the true nature of his crimes demonstrated that 18 years of freedom had done nothing to cure the psychological damage that made him capable of such violence. The impact of the List case extended far beyond the courtroom, influencing both law enforcement techniques and public understanding of family violence. Frank Bender's successful age progression sculpture established forensic artistry as a valuable tool for cold case investigations, leading to the solution of numerous other long-term fugitive cases. The collaboration between artists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals became a model for innovative approaches to seemingly impossible investigations. The case also highlighted the devastating effects of untreated mental illness and the dangers of religious extremism when combined with rigid personality traits. List's inability to seek help during his crisis, his preference for violence over admitting failure, and his capacity for self-deception provided important lessons for mental health professionals and religious leaders about recognizing and intervening in potentially dangerous situations. For the families and friends of List's victims, the conviction provided some measure of closure, but could never truly heal the wounds caused by his crimes. The children who might have grown up to have families of their own, the grandmother who should have lived out her final years in peace, and the wife who, despite her problems, deserved help rather than murder, all were lost to one man's inability to cope with life's challenges in a rational and moral way. John List's death in prison on March 21, 2008, at the age of 82, marked the end of a life that had caused immeasurable pain and suffering. He died unrepentant and apparently unaware of the true magnitude of his crimes, maintaining to the end the religious delusions that had justified mass murder in his twisted mind. The List family murders remain one of the most thoroughly documented cases of family annihilation in American criminal history, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangerous combination of mental illness, religious fanaticism, and personality disorders that can transform seemingly normal people into monsters. The case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals seeking to understand and prevent similar tragedies. Perhaps most importantly, the successful capture of John List after 18 years of freedom demonstrated that justice, while sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail. The combination of advancing forensic science, innovative investigation techniques, and the power of media to engage public participation proved that even the most careful criminals cannot escape the consequences of their actions forever. The legacy of Frank Bender's forensic sculpture work, launched to national prominence by the List case, continues to help solve cold cases and bring closure to families who have waited years for answers. The techniques pioneered in the search for John List have evolved with advancing technology, but the fundamental principle remains the same, that science, artistry, and determination can combine to ensure that justice is served, no matter how much time has passed or how cleverly criminals attempt to hide their true identities. The John List case stands as one of the most chilling examples of how family secrets and hidden trauma can explode into unthinkable violence, forever changing our understanding of what monsters can look like in everyday life. This methodical Sunday school teacher who convinced himself that murder was mercy reminds us that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that the most dangerous criminals are sometimes those we would never suspect. If you found this case as shocking and fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more incredible true crime investigations that expose the bizarre family secrets lurking behind history's most notorious murders. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest deep dives into the most mind-bending cases from around the world, where nothing is ever as it seems, and the truth is always stranger than fiction. From forensic breakthroughs that solve decades-old mysteries to psychological profiles that reveal the twisted minds of killers, we bring you the stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about human nature and family bonds. Join our community of true crime enthusiasts who appreciate the meticulous research and compelling storytelling that brings these incredible cases to life.